Last night, Russia launched 141 strike drones of various types at Ukraine. This was reported by the Air Force. According to preliminary data, 111 enemy drones were destroyed. Unfortunately, 24 drones hit 16 locations, and in one case, debris fell. There are still several enemy drones in the airspace, so please pay attention to air raid alerts. Kryvyi Rih in the Dnipropetrovsk region endured another massive drone attack. Shahid struck a 9-story apartment building and infrastructure enterprises. There were no casualties, but at least 30 buildings were damaged. Assistance centers have been set up in several districts of the city. People can receive materials to repair their damaged homes and apply for compensation from the city. And the night before, the Russians shelled Nikopol. 3 people were injured. The occupiers also attacked the Omirivska and Pokrovska communities with drones and artillery. There, apartment buildings and private houses, cars, 13 buses, a hair salon, private businesses, transport infrastructure, and power lines were damaged. In the Sinelnikivsky district, a drone attack destroyed 2 private homesteads. 1 person was killed and 4 others were injured in the Kherson region over the past day. This was reported by the regional military administration. Nearly 30 settlements in the region came under fire. Kherson suffered the most from the shelling. As a result of a strike on the central part of the city, a 79-year-old man was killed in his own home. 3 other elderly people were also injured. Russia terrorized the regional center with drones. In particular, explosives were dropped from a drone onto civilian vehicles. Several cars were burned. The occupiers also damaged 3 apartment buildings and 5 private houses. The armed forces of Ukraine advanced in the Kostiantynivka-Drushkivka sector. Geolocated footage from previous days recorded an advance to the southeast and south of Kostiantynivka. This was reported by the American Institute for the Study of War. Analysts note that a gray zone in the direction does not necessarily mean that Russians are present there, although they do infiltrate there. At the same time, researchers emphasize that after Starlinks were banned for the Russian army, the enemy has already managed to restore communications by 50 to 60% as they are installing Wi-Fi bridges and directional antennas at elevated positions. As for the Pokrovsk direction, the Russian advance there has slowed down, likely due to a shortage of NRK, which they use for the logistics of assault groups. 97% of residents have left the Dobropilya community in Donetsk region. However, more than 1,200 people still remain. This was reported by the Donetsk military administration. The largest number of residents, 950, are in Dobropilya. The Russians are just 11 kilometers away from it in a straight line. But the city is already almost destroyed. Those who remain are mostly elderly and people with limited mobility. Most of them categorically refuse to evacuate. Some can be persuaded. 2 stores are operating in the city, but there is no electricity, heat, or water. Instead, there are wells and generators. That's why a resilience center is still operating in Dobropilya. Hungarian authorities have detained 7 employees of the state. Ballistic missile attacks from Iran have decreased by 90%. This was reported by the head of U.S. Central Command, General Brett Cooper, while briefing on the progress of the military operation in the Middle East. Let me remind you, the American and Iranian Air Forces are currently focusing on destroying locations of personnel and launch complexes, both for missiles and those used to deploy Shaheds. Cooper also claims that during a week of hostilities, 30 Iranian ships were sunk, including a drone carrier. It had been converted from a container ship and was the pride of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. The General Staff of the Israeli Army reported that they managed to destroy approximately 80% of Iran's air defense systems and more than 60% of its ballistic missile launchers. Israel also announced the transition to the next stage of the campaign. They say the first part of the operation paved the way to Tehran, and further unexpected steps will follow. President of the United States Donald Trump is also preparing for his new stage. According to him, he mentions that Cuba is going to be the next destination. But it is necessary for us to wait for a while. Just for a few more weeks.
What is happening with Cuba is amazing. We want to finish this first, and it's only a matter of time before many incredible people return to Cuba. Marco Rubio will go down in history as the country's best Secretary of State. He is doing a certain job, and Cuba will be next. To keep watch over countries, over many years you can see bad things happening there. We will not allow anything bad to happen to this country.
Starting in 2023, Russia produced 400,000 people each year for the war against Ukraine. They were receiving enormous amounts of money, about 3 million rubles, which is approximately $40,000 for signing a contract. But at the end of last year, the money ran out and the contract to kill Ukrainians, now it costs not tens of thousands, but just a few $1,000s. How many mercenaries can Russia afford to buy under such conditions? And will the Kremlin dare to launch an open wave of mobilization? We are discussing this with Lyubov Tsibulska, an expert in strategic communications and a specialist in hybrid threats in Ukraine. Ms. Lyubov, thank you for coming to see us.
Hello.
Recently, your NGO Join Ukraine conducted a study on Russia's mobilization capabilities. So how many more people can the enemy recruit into its army?
Yes, indeed. We conducted such a study for our security institutions and analyzed several scenarios. And we insist that we cannot look only at the demographic component, how many people they can produce. We have to consider the political context and first and foremost the economic one. And given the economic context in particular, we see that the Russians are running out of money. 67 Russian regions have a budget deficit. And if, as you said, since 2023 they have only been increasing the payment for signing a contract, now many regions are forced to abandon these payments, these bonuses. The bonuses used to be 2 million, 3 million. The actual salary is about 210,000 rubles, which is not much really. The rest they received in the form of bonuses. And these bonuses, which fell on the shoulders of the local regional administrations, let's put it that way, they are now being forced to cancel. And now we see a trend where the Russians are able to recruit fewer people than they are losing directly on the battlefield. Why? Because the payments are getting smaller and smaller. And in fact, everyone who was very gung-ho, patriotic and extremely eager to go kill Ukrainians, they have already signed the contract. Everyone else was primarily motivated by financial reasons. And we see that there are significantly fewer of these people now, especially considering that there is less money in the Russian budget for this. Therefore, looking at the goals they set to answer your question, if the advance on the battlefield becomes more active and at least to achieve some kind of strategic objectives, because we understand that Ani, Siversk, Pokrovsk, all these small towns are not strategic goals, then they would need to mobilize at least 700,000 or more. But they don't have the funds for this. For this, they would probably have to announce a general mobilization, a forced mobilization, and that's already risky. Because when they carried out a partial general mobilization in 2022, it was a tremendous shock for Russian society. We know that over 1 million people fled from Russia and many more went into hiding. And overall, even then, there was a moment when they openly expressed their dissatisfaction. And we know that now this is politically dangerous, so they are doing everything they can to avoid this scenario.
But why is this politically dangerous? Are there still people there to protest, to take to the streets, to set police vans on fire?
They still understand that maybe the protest won't take the same form, but this security apparatus is also, to a large extent, A, dissatisfied, and B, they can't be sure whether this security apparatus will be able to suppress the discontent. Because in reality, for now, you can't even openly criticize the regime. We know that people get in trouble for likes, shares and reposts on social networks, including VKontakte, which is under complete control of the FSB. But at the same time, we understand that the level of discontent is still rising. Now we see a trend, if we analyze Russian on social networks, we see that for the first time they have started to speak openly about the economic losses from the war. This didn't happen before, not in 2023 or 2024. This is only now finally starting to happen. They have finally felt that taxes have become higher, that prices have gone up. They have finally felt that life has gotten worse. And that's why it's hard to predict. Kremlin is afraid that it might not be able to tighten the screws as it always has.
But already the losses of the Russian army are over 1 million killed and wounded. That's enormous, even for such a huge country as Russia. Is there a different attitude there toward the deaths of volunteers, these contract soldiers, compared to ordinary conscripts? And
since this is still a contract army, meaning they consciously go and sign this contract, and as we've already established, they are financially motivated, the attitude toward them is as follows. It's like, well, that's their choice. In other words, Russians are not emotionally, they are not sensitive to losses, unfortunately. So what we once thought, and what General Zaluzhny said, that we need 100,000 dead Russians and then something will change. Unfortunately, that's not the case. But at the same time, again, we see that all these killed, yes, maybe there isn't such nationwide mourning in Russia for them, but it's still a loss for the economy. That is, people have to work, and some regions feel this very acutely. And again, we have to understand that recruitment into the Russian army is disproportionate. That is, some regions give more than others. For example, the central wealthy regions like Moscow. And the near western regions, they don't feel this burden. So in reality, in those places, you hardly even notice this war. But in other regions, they have to, like, I don't know, Buryatia, they have to send more people. And at one point, the Russians even came up with a scheme. They would recruit more people from these ethnic republics and register them in Moscow, at least on paper. It looked as if all the regions were making a contribution.
But if they run out of money for such payouts, tens of thousands of dollars, those bonuses for signing a contract to go to war, then what other motivational tools does the regime have to keep recruiting mercenaries?
For now, we can't predict what else besides forced mobilization, obviously. They can always resort to that, but it's risky. But economic motivation was the main one. Now they are trying to change the legislation, constantly trying to introduce some amendments. One moment they're calling up reservists for 2026, then they're extending the mobilization period. In other words, now mobilization lasts the entire year. So they're still looking for a solution. It's not really to our advantage that Russian oil might become more expensive.
Maybe oil prices are going up.
And again, this is about financing this war machine. The year 2026 is when Russia could become exhausted, significantly worn out by the war, and we needed to put maximum pressure on that, impose more sanctions and obviously kill more, apply more pressure, but this increase in oil prices creates risks.